Now I'm going to invite Kay Woodward to come up on the stage. Kay has been working in the area around the NHS for a very long time. She's been trying to help people over a very long time. And she is probably the best lady we could have to give you some insight into what is really happening as the NHS is privatised. And to quote a gentleman I've been dealing with recently, is the NHS is dealing with the mechanics of modern murder. Kay.
Thank you. Thank you, Brian. Thank you, everybody, for coming. It's nice to see so many people, and I'm not used to speaking to this many people, so please excuse me. Reasserting and restoring the rule of law. Sorry? Reasserting and restoring the rule of law under the Constitution. What about the NHS Constitution? How many people are aware that the NHS has a constitution? How many people working in the NHS know that there is a constitution? How many people are here today that work in the NHS? Do you know that there is a constitution that gives us rights enshrined in law? It contains pledges and it contains promises. There's no ability to enforce the law around those, but the rights there is. So this is the document. It's a very thin document. If you contact the Department of Health, you can obtain a copy, or you can go online and print one off. I would encourage everybody to get a copy of this document, and whenever you come into contact with the NHS in any capacity, it's a plea, everybody you know, obtain a copy of this document. And let the people know that you come into contact with within the NHS. It is the NHS Constitution. The Department of Health, I've got the address and a contact number you can ring. The document says that the NHS belongs to all of us. Do you think the NHS belongs to you? Do you have a say in what happens in the NHS? Do you have a right to, you do have a right to have a say, but where is your voice heard? Exactly. Thank you. Thank you, Joan. This document is so important that in July 2015, the NHS produced a handbook to it. It's a 160-page document. The Department of Health won't send that to you. They just tell you to go online and print it off yourself. But you can access the document online. And it's a really important document, again, that I'd encourage everybody to obtain or at least have access to and read. Because that document details the legal basis of each right you have within that NHS Constitution. So it's beyond important that everybody is aware of it, and everybody that you come into contact with within the NHS, you make them aware of it, and you make them aware that you know what's in it and what they're there to do for you. The document itself is not a piece of legislation. Its status is that of a declaratory document. But it articulates what the legal position is, and there is a legal position. The rights within that constitution are legally enforceable, underpinned by common law. I've come across very few people in the country that know that. Again, the pledges and the responsibilities and the values that are detailed in it don't have a legal basis, but the majority of that document is it's actually detailed as your rights, and those rights are what are enforceable. They're legal rights that are protected in law. So we need to raise public awareness about this constitution, that it exists, and we need to get the rights within it enforced legally if we need to. Because in this country, we've currently got, I refer to the NHS as the National Harm Service. And I say that very openly, very frequently, to very senior people in the NHS who I come into contact with on a regular basis. To assert your voice, there are public venues within the NHS that you can go to. Your local clinical commissioning groups, who are the fund holders, who fund everything within the NHS in the area that you live in, they have public board meetings where you can go and speak, where you can go and raise concerns, questions, put these people on the spot. It's generally a board table full of primarily GPs that are running those clinical commissioning groups. The NHS Trust hospitals, they all have board meetings every month. They're public meetings that you can go to and speak at. Get a copy of this document and take it with you and ask how many people at NHS board level know of its existence, know that you have rights within it and you're there to assert those rights. I'm part of a national network of people that have got together who have all either been victims themselves or have friends, relatives, close family who've either been murdered, and I say murdered because that's exactly what it is, or attempted to be murdered within our caring NHS, the National Harm Service. And primarily that's what it's doing with intent to the most vulnerable people that come into contact with it in any capacity. And if you have an elderly relative or friend, I would urge you to make sure that someone, if it's not you, is able to be around them around the clock. If it's a person over 7... Yes. Well, ideally, you need to have some kind of recording device. Basically, Sue is saying that when you have anybody within an NHS setting, that you need to be keeping a record, taking notes, observing of medications that are being issued, anything that you see that is happening. You need to keep a diary, basically, and document everything. Ideally, you need to take in some kind of recording device. That gives you also a level of protection, but it also records everything as it should be recorded, because the extent of the horrific things that are happening are quite unbelievable. And you may have an elderly relative or a vulnerable relative in an NHS setting, and they will tell you things which are quite bizarre, and you will doubt. And these are generally people that you've known all your life, that you've never had any reason to distrust, they've never lied to you. And suddenly you may visit them and go home and think, well, I don't know what they're talking about, that was a bit odd, that wouldn't happen. They're there to receive care. You must believe what they say to you, because people are very quickly captive. The NHS takes ownership of your relative, and quickly they try and destabilise them initially, whether that's with falls, but secondary, it's getting a cocktail of antipsychotic and sedating medications into them as soon as possible, so that they can actually deem them having no mental capacity, or anything that they tell you, they're confused, so don't believe them because they don't know what they're saying. When it's actually the opposite. They know exactly what's happening to them and they're trying to tell you. We've got an older generation now that are very respectful of doctors. And initially, if they go into hospital once and they manage to escape, a first time in hospital, and then they're readmitted. It's generally the second time that they go in and that they realise there's something wrong, what's happening shouldn't be happening, and then that's at the point that they try and tell you the sorts of things that are actually happening or being administered to them against their will. And very quickly they're looking at doing a mental capacity assessment so that they remove the person's capacity. And then if you get what they consider to be problematic and start asking too many questions, they will quickly try and exclude you from visiting, from having contact with your own relative, because they take ownership of that relative. I've visited elderly people in hospital in Nottinghamshire, and I've gone back the next day and they weren't there. On a couple of occasions, that's because they died overnight. On a couple of occasions, I was told that, they moved this morning to a care home. Their relatives have come in the afternoon to visit them. There was no consultation with anybody. They've simply been moved. And when their relatives have gone home, they've been faced with a for sale board in their garden. Because we have people within the NHS who are making decisions. They say a person's got no mental capacity. They're not consulting family or anybody that has got rights for that individual once they've removed the patient rights. And then asset stripping by the state happens. Their property's stolen effectively. Their assets are stolen if they have any assets. And this is happening under their nose. They know that once you come into NHS care, the only thing you're going to be leaving in is a box. So they're pre-planning. The first thing they ask you when you go into hospital and they complete their questionnaire is, do you live in your own property? What relevance does that have to you accessing care for whatever it is you're going into hospital for? The other thing that you need to be aware of, that people are actually, you may go to take your relative to A&E with a very small, minor thing. Suddenly we need to keep them in for observation. And then they'll go to a medical assessment unit, and from there they're in. Once they're in the door, it's very difficult to get them out. You need to ask the questions about why the individual's there. Quite often they have no diagnosis. There's no reason for them to be there. If there is no clinical need for a person to be in an NHS hospital, there's no reason for them to be there. And therefore, if the person has got mental capacity and they don't want to be there, you need to get them to sign to say they want to go home, they don't need to be there, and they have to be released. It's almost like a prison sentence, isn't it? They have to be released, but it really is like that. And then you'll find trying to get them released becomes very difficult. 9 times out of 10, the police will be called just because a person wants to go home and they have no reason to be where they are. It's very distressing, particularly for the older generation, because they've never had any contact generally with the police ever. And suddenly they're faced with having their son or daughter or niece or nephew being threatened with arrest just because they're wanting them to take them home. We're into very, very dangerous times. There are people working with the NHS that are carrying out what I refer to as a death pathway. It isn't the Liverpool care pathway. It is a death pathway. I've experienced it personally myself. I've stayed in an NHS hospital round the clock to keep someone alive. And whilst I was there, I was doing, as Sue suggests, you keep a diary. You have to be very careful about how you do that, because their aim is always to eradicate you so that you don't actually know what's happening and what's going on. So you have to do that in a very measured and careful way. But do it. You have to do that because you do need, obviously, the evidence. Okay.
Lunchtime was creeping up, and I could just feel a little change there because Kay is very quietly spoken. I'm going to say to you, this lady is warning you of one of the most dangerous threats to each and every one of us there is. Because at some stage, all of us are users of the NHS. We have a gentleman who was at the highest levels of the NHS working with the government, and he has a deep knowledge of Staffordshire Hospital. How many of you know about that? Where a minimum of 1,400 people died. Well, that was a lie. It was thousands. And the gentleman says to us, but that wasn't it. There were at least 11 other hospitals with equivalent negligent death rates. In the press, if you Google this horrible subject, you will see doctors warning of their calculation of at least 130,000 elderly people dying unnecessarily every year. I will tell you that is a gross understatement. I will also tell you that, with that it went out of my head, undertakers are beginning to leave the profession. And why they're leaving the profession is they're getting a very large number. I'm sorry, this is a horrible subject, but we're adults. They are getting a very large number of severely emaciated bodies, people weighing 5 stone. And they know what is being done because they know what they're witnessing are people who've been deliberately dehydrated. Because by dehydrating, you can introduce dementia-like symptoms, and they then medicate with a cocktail of psychotropic drugs. And not recently, as a result of Hillsborough, unnoticed to people, there was a change in legislation went through because a young man was on life support. And in the decision through the courts, food became medicine which could be withdrawn. We are seeing not only elderly people, but also vulnerable people, disabled people, children with problems who are appearing in the undertakers' parlours in this condition. And the undertakers are scared because they know if they go to the police, nothing happens. The NHS is pushing through, everybody should be cremated. Why? Because the evidence goes. They are saying that one doctor can sign a death certificate. They are privatizing the undertaker's system so that people in hospital can go straight out with one signature to be cremated, to be gone. Now, bear with me just for 2 minutes because I want to just find something on this. Please let me just finish. This is part of the statistics which is being collected on the population. We've got top left, younger, more deprived. Bottom, younger, less deprived. Top right, older, more deprived. Bottom right, older, less deprived. And I can tell you that all the attention, and this is an NHS document, is in this area. There is a machine being assembled to get rid of, quote, useless eaters. And this lady, who is incredibly quietly spoken, can talk to you for a very long time about all the cases she knows where elderly people who are perfectly healthy suddenly become wrecks in the NHS and their property is stolen. I think that in the near future, we need to have a single conference on this topic of the NHS, and it is going to absolutely shock people. But the advice that you've been quietly given, you should pay attention to. Any relative going into the NHS needs to be constantly watched. What drugs are being administered and why? What is the diagnosis? Who is the consultant or the person responsible? And what is the actual care plan for getting them out of that hospital? Right. And what Kay has said to you is in doing this, you need to be very careful Because if they, the ward, decides that you're a nuisance, you will be banned from the ward, and then you have no protection of your relative at all. Right? I'm just putting these comments in. I've got a whole presentation I could give you on it. There's no time today. But I'm just going to really stick up for Kay, because she's quite quietly spoken, and you're all ready for your lunch. But she is actually warning you about something which the scale of it is horrific. And David Cameron recently said by 2030, I think it was, there will be 2 million people with dementia. How does he know? But it gets better. When I drove home from the UK Column office the other day, I listened to Radio 4, very unusually for me. And on the news, it was saying what the death rate from dementia was going to be. Well, hang on a minute, because dementia doesn't kill you. Well, it didn't. But in the NHS, that dementia is the route to killing people off. The NHS is rapidly being privatized. It is very nearly there. And this is not an NHS to make us better. It's an NHS to make profit out of as many drugs as possible. But they're looking at who you are. Are you elderly? Have you got assets and property? And if you have, you are a target. I'm going to leave it there. Kay, thank you very much.